Hello, welcome to Angular Orange. This is a tutorial on WebSockets. I'm going to show you architecturally what it's all about, and I'm going to then show you some code example. So here is the client-server communication. You could have a client communicating with a server using HTTP, and in that scenario you make a request, you get a response. It's referred to as half duplex. With WebSockets, it's really a full duplex. So the client and the server establish a connection, and then messages can be exchanged back and forth. Typically, the server pushes to all the client or all the users on the client. And we're going to go through a very simple example showing you one scenario how you can use the WebSockets. Okay, so HTTP and WebSocket communication, you can have a server, and you can interpret the server any way you want to, but I'll drill into that in a moment. Where on port 3000 you could be listening to HTTP, on port 3085 you could be listening to a WebSockets, and so a WebSocket messages, let's say. And the bottom line is that there's all these different scenarios of how this works. So if your client communicates with a port 3000 and it returns and it requests a web page, you could easily then bump it up to a WebSockets connection, or even have that client communicate through a different port number and create a WebSocket connection on the same server in the same server app. Okay, so for example, if I had a client that was communicating via HTTP to a port 3000, and then I also wanted to connect to port 3085 with a WebSocket connection, I could do that. In that case, the client is making web requests, and at the same time the server can push data to the client whenever it wants to. Like suppose a client is watching a stock price, and the server is pushing that constantly, that new price, and the client wants to analyze it, and when it reaches a certain threshold they want to buy it. At the same time they want to use the web application and go through HTTP. So let's not get too caught up on the complexity of this. We're going to show you really the WebSocket, and we're going to try to simplify this as much as possible. Okay, so let's look at the communication of the WebSocket. So step one, you start a Node.js application that instantiates a WebSocket server listening on a port. That's the first thing you do. Then you start up an Angular application that instantiates a WebSocket client and connects to the app server via the port. So we're going socket to socket, and now we've got a connection. We've established a connection. Once the connection is made, the client can send to the server can send to the client. And so there's a wide variety of scenarios of applications of what you want to do. We're going to be looking at a little combination of both of these in our code example. Okay, so then in step 3, the server can push a message. That is the app server Node.js application, which has a socket connection with the client, can then push a message. And that message gets passed to the client, and the client then can receive that message and display it to the user. And the way that is typically done on the Angular end is, once I receive the message, I want to set state of my component object, and I want change detection and property binding to display it to the user. So my job is to get that message in an attribute of a component instance and let Angular, the browser, and all the features of a web architecture to take effect. Okay, so also you can display messages to several users. So if I push a message, if both clients have a connection to the socket, you can push it to all the clients. And so you could have multiple connections. Okay, so let's look at the client server in detail. Now we're going to drill down. Okay, so we're talking about WebSockets here, And we have a yellow a client application, which is an Angular application. It sits inside of my index.html. It provides the functionality. So there's a root component, possibly a UI component tree there. Let's make it simple. We got a component template there. It's the root component template, and I'm going to call it app component. And and all this is running inside the browser. So hence, I've got the client blue index.html wrapping all of this, and my root module, and my app and my root component are running inside the application. So the architecture that we chose to use is that we have an app component with a template, and we have a WebSocket service which we're going to inject into the app component. And the app component is going to say to the service, give me my observable to subscribe to, and I'm going to subscribe to it. And once we do that, we're listening to socket messages through that observable. So that is the model. And so for the first step, you start the Node.js application that instantiates the WebSocket server, listening on the port. Step 2 is you hit on the index.html. It starts the application. The root app component is instantiated. The WebSocket service is instantiated and injected into the app component. The app component uses the service to create an observable, and then the app component subscribes to that observable. And once that happens, you have a socket connection that you're listening to, that you've subscribed to, and you're going to receive all of the data that the Node.js application is pushing through the socket. Okay, so the step 3 is WebSocket server pushes the client data. Okay, so we're looking at this data over here. Step 4 is the WebSocket service receives the data. Step 5 is, since the app component subscribed to that observable, it then receives the data. So there's a step here. The WebSocket service is injected into the app component. So when the app component first instantiates, it's got a handle on the WebSocket service, and in that constructor or something, I already subscribed to that observable. So as I'm getting the data, I'm updating attribute and instance attribute values in my app component. Step 6, change detection and property binding show the user the data. Now notice, the data in the app component instance changed. The change detection and the property binding basically say change the DOM element value that corresponds to this markup fragment. Then the browser pulls the data. Since the data changes in the DOM element, the browser pulls it. So there's Angular, there's the browser, there's all these different things that are working to our advantage. From an observable point of view, and from the WebSockets point of view, just make sure your app component's data is dynamically changing as data is being pushed from the Node.js socket, okay? Okay, so here's the WebSocket service. We'll go through the code in a minute, but you have to import the observable, and then you create this WebSocket service. And in there you have a WebSocket. When you create the observable socket, you instantiate the WebSocket via URL, and that URL is pointing to the server, and the port number is pointing to the port number that the Node.js socket is listening on. And then you return the new observable, which is really an observer which points to the WebSocket listening on the message. So what this does is say this socket on message do this. Well, this says observer takes the event and says observer next event data. Well, who excuse me, who is the observer? It's really the app component. So then you could also send a message using the WebSocket send message. So this is a service that's receiving events and can send events. In the app component, you include the WebSocket service, you provide the WebSocket service, you inject it into the constructor, and then you create the observable socket by pointing to the URL on the server. It's a different port number. And then you subscribe to that data. When the data comes in, the message from server gets created. Message from server is bound using this interpolation operator to the template. So you'll see the messages as the server code is sending them over. Now it's a little tricky. I know it's a simple set of code, but it's a little bit. I find it a little bit confusing because in the constructor you're basically creating the observable socket and you're subscribing to it. And you never really use it. You never really set that observable anywhere in your code. You're really just saying when the event happens with the data, just give me the data, and the data is really what you're interested in. I guess you could have implemented this a different way to make sure you understand where your observable attribute is located, etc. But in this case, it doesn't matter because we have the WebSocket here, and the service is giving us the observable using that socket. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a WebSockets example and go through that application code, and it'll become a little bit more clear. Now, first let me show you what I have in my project. I used Angular CLI to create a WebSockets project, and I basically put some server code in here, which I called a WebSocket server. And so, don't worry too much about this, because I mean, when I've been doing Node.js for a while, but the thing is, with this particular code, I kind of wanted to use TypeScript, and so it was my first time using TypeScript with Node, and so I just want to tell you that you waste a lot of time struggling and trying to do some of these things. So try not to if you're not a Node.js developer, don't worry too much about this. But I'll go through the Node.js code. First of all, with Node, you always use Express. Express is the part of Node it's a module which gives you the state of the session and enables you to do things a lot easier. Okay, and so you basically create this Express app. You have to import Express and import the path and import the server from WebSockets. So about the Express, you need to create an app, and you need to point to where the files, your HTML files, are going to be located. And so there is this expressed, the way to define where the static files are located is to use this static function, and you just join a bunch of directories, and you could actually create a path and define where your files are. And so here I'm really saying, okay, here I have some client code and my directory name .client. Here I have code I'm going to be using in Node modules, and so I'm actually pointing to different resources that my app might need. And then I do a get, which will point to a default file to retrieve, and I've chosen this client simple WebSocket just so that I could test my WebSocket. So this is like just a test program to test my WebSocket, but I don't really need it. And nor do I need to hit on the /, but it's a good way to test your Node.js app to make sure it's working with a socket. Okay, so let's look at the other important things. First of all, you have a constant HTTP, and your app is listening on, let's say, port 8000, and you get the HTTP port address, and then you log the HTTP service listening on this port. Okay, then you also create a WebSocket server, and you instantiate a server on a particular port, and that's your WebSocket server. And then the simple thing that I did was I said, okay, the WebSocket server is listening on this port, and then I said, on the connection, that is when Angular makes a connection to my server, I will send a message. It's pushed by the WebSocket server, and you'll see that on the front end. Also, when the client sends a message, I log server received the message, I get the date, and I send back another message with the date on it. So what I'm going to verify is this round trip of Angular connecting with a socket with Node.js. Once the socket's connection is created, the Node.js app sends a message called "This message was pushed by WebSocket server," and then as I click on a button on the front end in the Angular app, I'm going to be sending hello from client to the server, and the server is going to look at today's date and send that message back. So you'll see that as I send the message, this round trip comes where I'm pushing data, and the point is not to make this a physical, realistic example, but the point is that when you click on a button on the Angular application, like get stock price, whatever, you can get the latest stock price, or you can say, show me the stock prices, and basically show a table of stock prices that are dynamically changing as the server is pushing the new prices. So that's something you might want to take a look at. Okay, so instead of wasting your time with that as much, let's see what we have here. Oh, in my server, the other thing is my TypeScript compiler is in my path. It doesn't seem to be working, so I created this variable which points to it, and now I'm in the directory where the WebSocket server is located, and I just transpile it, and that I'm getting some simple error which I can get rid of, but I just want to show you this initially. So it generated the JavaScript file. So now I could run Node against the JavaScript file. And the server code says, I'm listening on 8000 for the HTTP server. The WebSocket's listening on 8085 rather. So now let's go look at my client code. Oh, okay, so I have this Angular application client code. And I have an app module which bootstraps an app component. And I have an app component. And basically that app component uses a WebSocket service. I use the environment file. That's where I put the URL. The URL for the WebSocket URL. And I have an app root. I point to my external template, my external style sheet, and I list the WebSocket service as a provider. I could have done that in the module. Okay, so the app component has a message from the server. That's where I keep my messages that are being pushed from my server-side socket. I have a title called WebSocket Demo. I have the WS, which is the WebSocket. Now, the other thing that's a little bit confusing here is, where is this type defined? Well, it is type okay, it isn't in the observables package, but obviously, okay, it is in the observables package. That's all I want to say, and the WebSocket service includes that. So, okay, so then I have a URL string. So the first thing I do is in the constructor, I inject the WebSocket service into the constructor. This is my WebSocket service. I create an observable socket using the URL, which is coming out of the environment file. And then I subscribe. The message from the server is always defined as the data getting pushed to the client. And then, of course, of course, I could also send a message. Which really is using the web service to send a message. Okay, and so let's go look at the web service. So basically, what I've done is I created an app component, which its state, that is this guy, can be changed as the Node.js pushes data through the socket to the Angular client. Once this data is set, I don't have to worry about anything. I do property binding, change detection, property binding, the browser pulling the new DOM values. It's all good. So let's look at the service. Here we got the service, and in the service, it's just like what I showed you. You create an observable socket, you pass the URL in, you instantiate the client socket, and then you return an observable which listens for those messages. So the WebSocket on message sends the next data to the observable. Now, what we've seen is the observable doesn't have to really, it really needs the data that's being pushed. So we did that inside of the app component, and we'll go back to that in a minute. So the important thing to realize here, I mean, this is a little abstract, but I must tell you, between the WebSocket and an observable, the state and the asynchronous nature of the objects, it is kind of complex. Okay, so, and then we also have this send message. So on this service, you could send a message, and it takes the WebSocket and it sends the message. So that goes from client to server. The Node.js socket receives that data. And of course, upon receiving, we log server received data, and then we take the new date and we push it back to the client. Okay, so let's just quickly see if there's something we should be showing you here while we're talking about this. So let me just log here. Let's go back and take a look and see where my server's running. It's running right here. Okay, so first, when we first render the application, the Angular application, the app component gets instantiated. We have to establish a connection. Now the server's listening on a port already. It's already running. It's listening on a port. The particular constructor here, when it creates the observable socket using this service, it connects. And the WebSocket server, upon connection, will log some data. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to render this for the first time. This is happening. Let me go back to my server and see what I got running here. This is my WebSockets project. I am running Angular 5. Then I went back into WebSockets. I fired up the server. That should be listening on a port. And then, I guess what I didn't do is to go back here and do an npm start. Okay, now let's go here and see what happens, if anything's going to happen over here. Okay, let's go back and take a look at the code once more. Okay, so to review, what we did was we have an app module which bootstrapped app component. App component is a component which uses a service. We listed that as a provider, and then we injected it into the constructor. Once it was there, we used that service to create an observable socket, and we're listening on it. And as the data comes through, we're setting the message from the server in this component, and then we're rendering it up here using the interpolation directive. Now, I have another button here which sends a message back to the server, and when I do that, I log client sending message to WebSocket server, and I send the message hello from client. So you should be able to see different things happening on both ends. Okay, so let's see what this is. I did an npm start here. I don't know why that wasn't taking me so long. Now, this port number, do is I'm going to test this thing out by doing a local host 8085. What was it? Was it 80 localhost 8085? Let me go back to my Node.js app. 8085. Now I think I have to bang on 8000. Okay, so that hit on this thing's still building. That's amazing. Okay, so upon connection, all it did was send a message over to the client. And so what I just did just now is I just hit on my test client, which was here. It sent a message, and I grabbed the message and put it in this element. This is my little test code. Now I'm still waiting for this thing to happen. Okay, now I can go back to the front end and show you that. Now I'm going to hit on my Angular application, and let me go take a look at my log file. Let me see what basically happened here. I don't want to look at that message. I guess there's a message that happened with me using a different client to do the test. Okay, so here we are. Welcome to the WebSocket demo, Angular subscriber to the WebSocket service. And when the Angular app first connected to the Node.js app, on connection, the server sent back a message to the client. It said this message was published to by the WebSocket server. Now I'm going to send a message back to the server. And let's go see what happened with that. Server received a hello message from the client. The server then sent back a message saying date pushed by server, and it shows you the date. Now I'm going to go ask for the date again. Notice the time, 13:03:57. Send message, and I got a different time. Client sending message to the WebSocket server. The server got the message, hello from client, instantiated a new date, sent it back to the client. See, I received another hello from client. Let me just do this once or twice. I'm getting these updated times. And you'll see I keep saying hello to the server. Now let me just show you the server code again. So on the message, when I first connect, I just basically send back the message was pushed by the socket server. When I get a message from the client, I say server received hello from client or whatever. I instantiate a new date. Date pushed back to the server. This WebSocket on the server side then does a send. So notice I got two sends, right? I got the send message from the client, and I've got send message from the server. Okay, that's all I really wanted to show you, a simple example of WebSocket, and like I said, the real one of a better model would be for you to fire up a different browsers and have the server push to all the browser instances. Maybe we'll give that a particular. We could look at that as an exercise to do. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to show you, and have fun.